Hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our 3-part workshop on race with Dr. Brenda J. Allen. My name is Stephanie, and I'm the event coordinator for Boulder Bookstore. So thank you all so much for coming to this workshop series. It is with your support and your book purchases that we can bring you cool things like this. And before we start, then we'll just do a brief bio. So Professor Emerita Brenda J. Allen retired in April 2019 as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion and Professor of Communication at the University of Colorado, Denver in the Anschutz Medical Campus. During almost 30 years with the university, Professor Allen developed a track record for scholarship, teaching, service, mentorship, and training. Among her numerous publications is a groundbreaking book entitled Difference Matters, Communicating Social Identity. She is working on a 3rd edition. She is also developing a global online course on inclusive leadership for Coursera. All right, so with all that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Allen.
Hello, thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone who joined us the last time, and welcome to those of you who are joining today. I'm so pleased to be with you to describe the topic for today, which is why is race relevant to everyone? So, why is race relevant to everyone I want to set the stage for our session by starting with a story. In October 2010, I was at a conference in St. Petersburg, Florida. While walking in front of the hotel where I stayed, I saw a newspaper box. You've seen them before. The top half of the paper was displayed in the window of the box. It showed several small headshots of men who appeared to be Latino in about 5 rows and columns. When I glanced at the paper, my brain thought, who are they? Are they in the country illegally? I looked a little closer to read the article, and I was deeply ashamed of myself. Do you know who they were? They were the 33 miners in Chile who were trapped underground and survived for 69 days. I have been following that story, and I have been gratified to see men of color portrayed so positively as their story unfolded. Yet my brain immediately assumed something negative. Why do you think that happened? Well, for one thing, the small pictures look like mugshots. Also, a wealth of research has concluded that mainstream media routinely depicts people of color negatively, especially Black and brown men. Combine that with stereotypes about men of color as criminals, and I can understand my knee-jerk reaction. I was guilty of what I call TUI, thinking under the influence of dominant beliefs about race. The disturbing thing about this is that I had written a similar reaction to a different newspaper page in my book, Difference Matters. Seriously, Brenda J? Yeah, child, I'm a product of this society. So the story denotes some of the race matters that we are going to explore here this afternoon. Race, like race or gender, is one of the first things that we notice and about a person, whether consciously or not. We often depend on race to provide clues about a person. This tendency is evident when people ask individuals, what are you? In this case, I figured the men were Latino because of their skin color and their hair texture, but I could have been wrong. So I'm going to explore issues related to race and communication, including how the media socialize us. In addition, I will connect historical developments to how contemporary communication unfolds. As you will see, racism affects and has always affected how we communicate race in the United States. The consequences include racial disparities that we talked about last time. So for today then, I will define racism and anti-racism. I will clarify why race is a social identity category, explain how we are all socialized to enact race, and describe some dynamics of interracial communication. I want to remind you, though, that the key takeaway from Monday's session is that race is a social and political construct designed to uphold whiteness as supreme. Race has played a fundamental role in shaping policy, behavior, and attitudes with detrimental consequences or people of color. As we did last time, I want you to set your intention. Given what's going on in the world and in your lives, and I know that some of you intended to be here Monday, but life intervened. It might be easy to be distracted or to participate only on a surface level. That's why I'd like you to set an intention, to specify what you hope to gain. And please keep these intentions in mind throughout our time together. I also invite you to agree to be open-minded and receptive. If I share something you already know, ask yourself how and why being reminded might be valuable right now. For something you didn't know that you feel skeptical about, suspend your judgment. Ask yourself, what if this is true? For something you didn't know but receive as credible that evokes any kind of emotion, such as frustration, guilt, shame, anger, or sadness, be grateful that you carry not to be emotional. Some people could not care less about these topics. Also, remember, one of our goals is for you to use what you learned to make a difference. And one way to respond to your emotions is to be more committed to affect change. That's what I did when I caught myself TUI about the minors. Here's some additional food for thought. This quote by James Baldwin. Excuse me. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And as we go forward this evening, I want to offer you a way to process your experience. So if you have a sheet of paper, you can set it up like this, or just keep these topics in mind as I go forward. I want you to think about insights and ideas that may come up for you as I share with you today, and to track your emotions and examples that you might have experienced, witnessed, or heard about. For instance, when I describe interpersonal racism, you might realize that you've said or done something like that. Or you might remember a specific example where you've experienced what I'm explaining. Either way, this may evoke emotions, and I encourage you to track them. The second column is to keep track of insights or aha moments and ideas for what you might do. You see, cultivating mindfulness and self-awareness is crucial for understanding and fighting racism. When I was teaching, students found this approach to processing helpful, especially as they view videos or films. It helped them to prepare for discussion. I hope it will be useful for you. You can refer to your notes or your thoughts along these lines as you reflect on the series and when you make your personal action plan on Friday. So I'm going to start then with racism. What is it? As this slide says, racism equals race prejudice plus social and institutional power. Racism equals a system of advantage based on race. Racism equals a system of oppression based on race. Racism equals a white supremacy system. And those of you who were with us on Monday recall how that was constructed somewhat arbitrarily and stuck. So a crucial point of this definition is that racism is systemic and not individualistic. That is really key here because, as I shared in the first session, there's an abundance of data about racial inequities and disparities related to quality of life and longevity from inception to death, evident in every sector of private and public life. Something to understand as well about racism is that some people of color experience what is known as racial battle fatigue. These are psychophysiological symptoms ranging from just a kind of sense of lethargy, high blood pressure, anxiety, frustration, anger, depression, as people of color experience navigating historically white spaces. Can experience these environments as stressful, exhausting, somewhat diminishing to our sense of self-efficacy, comfort, and well-being. Now, mind you, this, of course, is not all people of color. It also can depend on what's going on in the world and in our lives. Right now, I can tell you that many of us are feeling especially fatigued, myself included, these days as we struggle to process our own emotions and deal with other things in our lives while being inundated with requests from typically well-meaning white people who want to apologize and or want us to help them process their newfound awareness that racism is real, or to educate them. The system of racism, it's important to understand, undermines realization of the full potential of our whole society because of the waste of human resources. Can you imagine what the world would be like had everyone, regardless of their race, really have access to education, healthcare, really had a sense of high self-esteem based on how they're depicted in the media and so forth? What the world would be like if that were the case. And that's part of what I hope we are imagining and striving to occur. So type of racism is structural racism. As the slide says, structural racism refers to the ways in which history, public policies, cultural stereotypes and norms, and institutional practices interact to maintain racial hierarchies and inequitable racial group outcomes. Structural racism involves the cumulative and confounding effects of multiple institutions, regardless of the intentions of the people who work within them. For instance, the Black and brown children who are suspended or expelled from preschool, and I still can't wrap my arms around why you suspend or expel a preschooler, but anyway, those Black and brown children who are expelled or suspended from preschool at disproportionate rates will face negative impacts for the rest of their lives during experiences within various other organizations and institutions that embed implicit and explicit racism. Perhaps you've heard of the school to prison pipeline. And trust me, if you haven't and you don't know about it, the data fully substantiate. And I mentioned that on Monday in terms of criminal justice system. At every point along the way, successively, if you are a person of color, you are less likely to, you're more likely to have literally the book thrown at you. The next type of racism is institutional racism. This refers to policies and procedures that produce racially inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. This includes things such as unfair policies and practices, discriminatory treatment, and inequitable opportunities. This concept was conceived in the 1960s by the African-American activist Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Nkrumah, to distinguish this type of racism from the bigotry or racial bias of individuals. Institutional racism can operate with or without the awareness of dominant group members or their representatives, and does not require malicious intent, although that often is in place. So societal institutions are the primary settings where patterns of racial discrimination are established and perpetuated. And they're the primary settings in which we can disrupt and dismantle racism. Overt institutional racism has been responsible for, as the images show here, things such as slavery, settlement, Indian reservations, segregation, residential schools for Native Americans, and internment camps, and others, some of which I mentioned on Monday. Recall the Mexican repatriation, which actually many of those persons were citizens. While these types of institutions and institutional practices no longer exist for the most part, their impact is still felt, and specifically in terms of covert institutional racism. Despite the fact that anti-discrimination laws were passed in the mid-20th century and later, major racial disparities persist. You probably see I've been redundant about that, but it's really important to understand the disparities and their impact. Institutional racism is evident in policies and practices, and forms of institutional racism are often disguised. They're embedded, they're hidden in standard operating procedures, as well as norms and expectations and assumptions. So while institutions don't have to operate in an explicitly racist manner for the effects of their actions to be discriminatory, the persistence of institutional racism relies on active and persistent negative attitudes toward people of color within society at large. Author Ira Katznelson offers a history of various periods in the United States to demonstrate structural and institutional racism. Fascinating. In one section, he focuses on the wartime experiences of African Americans and the discriminatory dimensions of the GI Bill. And the GI Bill, if you've heard about it or you know about it, has been touted as one of the most important things that the US government has done, et cetera. But if you peel back, if you look behind the curtain, you see some things that are extremely disturbing. So with the help of the GI Bill, millions of veterans bought homes, attended college, started business ventures, and found jobs commensurate with their skills. This legislation, according to one author, helped to create middle-class America. The GI Bill's race-neutral language probably led the 1 million African-American veterans to believe that they could take advantage of federal assistance, despite the fact that they had been segregated as part of their service. However, they had starkly different experiences than their white counterparts based on anti-Black racism related to all of the types of institutions who were related to the bill. Yes, the federal government stepped in to pay mortgages for white veterans and upgrade educational institutions, which, by the way, weren't that very welcoming to Blacks around that time anyway. So most African Americans watched these developments from the sidelines. The cumulative effect of these policies was the widening of the economic gap along racial lines. And I invite you to consider the intergenerational implications of this. The third type of racism is internalized racism, where members of stigmatized races accept negative messages about their own abilities and intrinsic worth. This includes personal beliefs and biases about race and racism, however, they stem from systems and society and messages that produce and perpetuate this. A vivid example for me is a song that my Black friends and I used to sing when we were little kiddos. So when you're white, you're right. And if you're brown, stick around. But if you're Black, ooh baby, I'll get back, I'll get back, I'll get back. The colorism implied in this song exists, I learned later, among other races. It's exemplified in many ways, such as bleaching cream or other ways that have beauty standards that revere whiteness. I found, as I did research for a project on the criminal justice system, that it isn't just being Black that makes a person more likely to be sentenced to jail in the United States, it's how Black they are. A person's lifetime chance of having been arrested, the study found, is directly proportional with the darkness of their skin. These examples reflect the persistence and prevalence of white supremacy. As racist systems reinforce the power and expand the privilege of white people, they actively discourage and undermine people in communities of color. In addition, racially minoritized groups and individuals are unconsciously and habitually rewarded for supporting white privilege and power and punished and excluded when we do not. Dr. Jones provides another good example with a saying among some Black people that, quote, the white man's ice is colder. This dictates decisions such as with which racial groups one will do business. If you haven't heard this before, please look it up. It's a chilling, pun intended, reminder of the strength of white supremacist belief systems. Internalized racism shows up in a variety of ways, including negative judgments about one's own race, as well as about other people of color, holding other people of color among ourselves to a higher standard than white people, giving more credence to white people's thoughts and ideas, the imposter syndrome, which leads members of minoritized groups to question their value. The next type of racism is personally mediated or interpersonal racism, referring to a system mediated through people with differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. One example of this, oh, by the way, many scholars do refer to this type of racism as interpersonal. Dr. Cameron Phyllis Jones describes it as personally mediated in order to honor the systemic nature of interpersonal interactions. This helps us to move away from locating racism only within an individual, although certainly we as individuals are implicated within racism. Personally mediated racism can occur in all of the ways and places that individuals communicate with one another, including microaggressions, defined by Dr. Sue as predictable racial microaggressions are everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages related to one's racial identity. Members of racially minoritized groups are subject to experience or anticipate a constant stream of these small insults and slights, which can take its toll. If you're not familiar with microaggressions, I encourage you to learn about them. In addition to the examples shown on the screen, being mistaken for a position lower in an organizational hierarchy, for example, being mistaken as the janitor or the secretary. Now, please hear me. I am not saying there's anything at all wrong with those roles because they are critical to institutions. The challenge is the assumption that, for example, that happened to me when I was at CU Boulder and I was an assistant professor. So it's sort of assuming that someone like me couldn't be across the organizational hierarchy. Other sayings are things like, you're so articulate, or all lives matter, I'm colorblind. As I mentioned earlier, what are you? So this notion of racial microaggressions is something that is significant to understand. And also it's a way forward in terms of learning what some of those statements are and trying to understand why they are important, as I'll share a little later, and then striving not to do or say them. Because I cannot stress enough the cumulative impact of these types of behaviors and attitudes on top of other types of racism. The next type is anti-Black racism. Any attitude, behavior, practice, or policy that explicitly or implicitly reflects the belief that Black people are inferior to another racial group, reflected in all the other levels of racism as a function of white supremacy. African American Studies professor Kihana Ross explains in a recent New York Times article, so when we're trying to understand how a white police officer could calmly and casually channel the weight of his entire body through his knee on a Black man's neck, a man who begged for his life for over 8 full minutes until he had no air left with which to plead, we have to understand that there's never been a moment in this country's history where this kind of treatment has not been the reality for Black people. And I shared a little bit of that with you last time in terms of history post-slavery, the ways that especially people in the South, white people in the South, wanted to keep Black people in their place. And that included militia and folks arresting and imprisoning or otherwise treating Black people in the ways that this depicts. So this type of racism is perpetuated by white people as well as non-Black people of color. I've been so heartened to see that groups and individuals from other communities of color have made strong, explicit commitments to the Black Lives Matter movement. Recall that racial disparities document that the data document that Black people usually are the most impacted, often along with Native Americans. Also understand that an emphasis on anti-Black racism, if we make headway in that, we will really make headway in terms of racism, period. And how to do that is through anti-racism, an active process of identifying and challenging racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes to redistribute power in an equitable fashion. And that racial equity is what we should strive to occur, a condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. And the statement goes on to give some sense of ways that we can do that. So at this time, I'd like you to think about this poll question. Stephanie, if you would assist me, please, with this. When it comes to improving race relations, which do you think is most important to focus on? And please make your selection. Okay, I think you can conclude it now. So you see the results of 82% of those responding felt the unique experiences, 18% felt what groups have in common. Thank you, Stephanie. So just keep in mind that part of what I've been sharing is that different people have different notions of what race and racism are, if they're real, and how we might address it. And this is one example of that. And by the way, I think it's both. So now we're going to move, now that we've looked at race and racism and types of racism, we're going to move into the realm of social identity. Social identity refers to one's sense of oneself based on being a member of a group. And there are some components to social identity. It's group-oriented, based on membership that's perceived by others and or self. And I say that can be perceived by others because others may impose a social identity on you and treat you as if you were a member of that group. Social identity is meaningful to self and or to others. It's identifiable, there are labels for it. We learn these labels, we learn about who we are. Often they are assigned to us. So as you think about these notions of social identity, look at this wheel of some types of social identity categories because there are many more of them. So if you think about this notion of social identity, then I want you to think about yourself. And remembering that the definition is one's sense of oneself based on membership in particular groups, identifiable, assigned, learned, meaningful, etc. Could you make a list of 25 social identity categories for yourself? This is something I love doing in workshops. We don't have time to really delve into it. So I'm going to give you a list of, I think it's about 25 for me. Baby boomer, Black, professor, spouse, executive, Gemini, senior citizen, straight, US citizen, scholar, womanist, middle class, cisgender, sister, African American, wife, teacher, mentor, trainer, activist, manager, woman, social scientist, godmother, foodie, heterosexual, consultant, partner, role model, doctor, in quotes, because it's PhD, not MD, which folks at a certain campus help me to remember that. Female, educator, retiree, professor, emerita. So the point here is that each of us is a collection, a composite of a wide variety of social identities. Race is one of them. Race, I believe, and so do others, is a primary one of them. And I want you just to think for a moment about your race and whether or not your race matters to you. Has the label for your race remained the same across your life? How do you communicate or enact or perform race? If I didn't see you, is there something you could do or say that I could be able to discern your race if you told me something about you? And so Monday, I also asked the extent to which your race mattered as a point of your identity, and those responses varied. And as you may also remember, research shows that for the most part, white persons are not as likely to see race as a significant part of their identity. And some people of color are somewhat, and as I recall, Blacks in particular are highly likely to see that. So this notion of who are you and social identity, and the reality is that we are all, this is a beautiful blend of a lot of different identities, is however that oftentimes people will reduce to one or two identities. As I go back to me looking at those newspaper pictures, that's what I focused on. And I drew upon implicit biases. This notion of thinking about we're all composites, it's critical to understand a concept called intersectionality, also called intersectionality theory or intersectional theory, which talks about the overlap of more than one non-dominant social identity category that contributes to a specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination that an individual might experience. Legal scholar and attorney Kimberly Crenshaw based this on some cases she tried of employment discrimination by Black women. And she said, quote, "The law seemed to forget that Black women are both female and Black, and thus subject to discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and often a combination of the two." To give you a sense of intersectionality, I want you to watch the short video.
My name is Ariel Newton. I am the founder of BlackMillennials.com. I'm also an organizer with Black Lives Matter New York City. Race and gender, race and sexuality. I am Black. I'm also a woman. I'm also queer. That means that I have to deal with racism, patriarchy, and homophobia. We have to be comfortable and clear that we're not playing oppression Olympics. It's just recognizing that these various systems of oppression are going to work to marginalize some folks more than others. To them, I say they are uncomfortable with the depth of existence. I think they're hiding behind their fear. I think they hide behind the fear of recognizing even when they perpetuate certain things. So, for example, white feminists get very upset when Black feminists are like, no, we're not going to be all women. We're going to say that Black women, Indigenous women are oppressed more than white women. And if you're uncomfortable with that, then that means that you're not fighting for all women to begin with. Ultimately, that's what makes our battle stronger, if we can recognize and be more comprehensive in how we go about advocating when we understand that folks are intersectional beings. Our oppression doesn't all look the same. Our oppression is determined by what we look like, what we sound like, where we grew up, where we went to school, if we went to school. And that's why it's important that as we try to dismantle oppressive systems, that we're clear that some folks are oppressed more than others. We have seen primarily, even within Black liberation struggles, some of these oppressive behaviors repeat themselves. Black women and Black transgender people are often erased and silenced, their labor co-opted by dominant heteronormative ideals. We have to unlearn these behaviors and ultimately understand that these behaviors came by way of white supremacy. So if we're clear that our oppression, the ways that we perpetuate oppression within our own community, we can better achieve racial justice. Sometimes I say that I put my Blackness before my womanhood, or I put my Blackness before my queerness, and I'm trying to unlearn that compartmentalizing of my being. My entire being is what informs how I navigate the world, how I respond to injustice, how I promote justice. It's hard for people to be complicated or to recognize complication. Folks like things easy. Today I'm going to say no more. Today I say that I am a full human being, and my humanity is wrapped up in a lot of different layers and tiers and so many different things. And that's beautiful. It should be celebrated, although it might be more difficult to understand.
I highly recommend that you check out that series. It's absolutely phenomenal. And as she spoke about being a whole person, complex, every single one of us is. So let's move as we come towards the end of our time together this evening to talking about communicating race. I just want to look quickly at a few topics, each of which is subject of volumes of books, of courses, et cetera, but I just want to be sure you have these on your mind. Let's start with race labels. Oh, I'm sorry. I now have another question for you. So when you were growing up, your family rarely, sometimes, or frequently talked about race. Okay, thank you. I think that gives us a pretty good sense. And you'll see that in terms of this audience, the highest percentage rarely talked about race. That, as you might predict, in terms of talking about race within the household, that tends to occur most often for people of color. And by the way, that talk about race varies. It isn't always about something regarding white people or other races. It's often about a sense of pride. It's often about valuing who we are. And I believe that's important because it's in contrast to the other messages that we've received. So we can stop sharing those results right now and now move into a little bit more about communicating race. First of all, thinking about race and the media. So with race and the media, as I mentioned in the beginning, with my example, right, mass media plays a key role with people of color underrepresented. And when at all present, they're cast in a narrow set of typically negative roles, whether it is, if we're talking about things such as fiction or drama or comedies, et cetera. And then in terms of the news and so forth, there's really just a lot of research on that. And the report, Moving the Race Conversation Forward, provides a comprehensive analysis of various forms of media, television, and newspaper. And one of their findings is, quote, most of the mainstream's media's racism content is not systemically aware. On average, about 2 out of 3 articles on race and racism fail to include a perspective with any insight on systemic level racism. Many of these cases focus on racial slurs and other types of personal prejudice and individual racism. And taken together, these harmful discourse practices often seem to promote a general standard of colorblindness while simultaneously promoting so-called race-neutral policies and practices. The media, by showing racism as individual acts, can really neglect to examine and even provide information and insight about systemic societal factors. And this will really prevent us from any progress. In addition, there are race labels. And so what we call ourselves and one another, these matter even as they matter differently for different individuals and groups. I think I asked you rhetorically the other day, how do you describe your race? And have you always used the same thing across your life? And do other members of your group maybe use different ones? And if you have options to describe your race, which do you prefer? Why? Are there any that you don't want to be called? If we had time, we'd talk a little bit more about that. You remember I told you that I like to be called Black because James Brown told us to when I think we were teenagers, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud. And this was at a time when how we insulted one another as little colored kids was to put Black before the name. So you Black jerk, you Black fool. And that is, again, an example of internalized racism. I had a disturbing experience when I was vice chancellor when someone called to report that someone had used the N-word. And as this person was sharing, this telephone was on my ear. As he was explaining it, he kept actually saying the word, a white man. And he said, and then he said the word in my ear. It was really hard to take. So in terms of race labels, if you ever wonder about somebody's race, first ask yourself why that even matters. Ask yourself, why do you want to refer to them by their race? You may realize it's not even necessary. And if you feel that it is, maybe ask the person and think about, don't guess or assume, and strive for specificity. I just encourage you to be cautious and careful about this in terms of race labels. And then there's everyday interactions at work and in many other settings. Here I've observed, and others have as well, is it just seems difficult for mixed race groups to talk about race with one another, or even to say the word race. So when I was in a senior leadership role, I often said to my colleagues, look, race is not a 4-letter word. And this was during instances when we clearly were discussing racial identity, and in fact, bragging about the fact that our student body was quote unquote diverse, or even that the campus was diverse, when I would say, well, actually, we're talking about the student body, we're talking about students of color in terms of their race and ethnicity, or they may even use terms such as culture. Sometimes when race is brought up, individuals will assert the need to look at other categories such as class and gender. This diverts attention from race by referring to other social identities and making race a lower priority. And the impact of this logic can inhibit true discourse from naming racism as a primary factor in hierarchies in our society, because maybe there are more comfortable factors to blame. As I mentioned briefly earlier, everyday actions often consist of racial microaggressions. It's important to educate ourselves, and I say ourselves intentionally because thanks to the person who posed the question about the act against Chinese, and I've decided I'm not even going to say the name, and I'm going to take it off of the slide. But it was an act, it was a name, a pejorative name used to describe Chinese, and I realized that it was negative. But then I made the mistake, and I apologize to all of you for actually having, just because it was called that act, doesn't mean that I needed to repeat it on the slide. So you just got to be really aware and alert and willing to admit, oh, my bad, let me try to do better. So here's one example to consider. Consider using the platinum rule. You're probably familiar with the golden rule, which is to treat others as you would want to be treated. And certainly that's one option for being anti-racist, right? For fighting against anti-Black racism, and especially as related to cross-racial interactions. However, persons from different racial groups can have different experiences and attitudes based on racism that would better benefit from the platinum rule, to treat others as they want to be treated. So, do you know that it is deeply insulting to most Black men to call them boy? If so, do you know why? Historically, white men routinely described Black men as boys to suggest that they weren't on equal footing with them. This includes, for example, thousands of Black men who worked as porters on railroad trains. Inventor George Pullman's sleeping car was a luxurious railroad coach designed for overnight travel. Many passengers called porters boy or George after George Pullman, regardless of these men's real names. This was from when slaves were referred to by their master's name. So calling them boy meant that they were George Pullman's boy or servant. This demeaning history is one reason why videos and photos of the sanitation strike that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led in Memphis in 1968. These photos show many of the Black male attendees holding signs saying, "I am a man." Now, if a white person or a non-Black person hears that a Black man is insulted for being called a boy, the golden rule might dictate a response like, well, that wouldn't bother me, or that wouldn't be a big deal to me. So if you did that unto me, it would be okay. And in some ways, this is a way to treat others disrespectfully by denying their feelings. The golden rule assumes equal experience and attitudes that can draw upon racist attitudes and beliefs and become a microaggression, if not a micro assault. The platinum rule invites acknowledgement that other feelings and attitudes exist. It also requires curiosity and a true willingness to learn about others. A final category of race and communication is racial dialogues. So the reference that I mentioned earlier with the race conversations, one of their quotes says that aversions to talking about race, at least in mixed race groups, demonstrate that our national conversation on race is stuck. More is needed to move our race conversations forward in more satisfying, informed, and productive ways. And racial dialogues are a promising approach to formal, facilitated conversations designed to promote interracial harmony. And oftentimes these involve topics of race, racism, and whiteness. And it's filled with intense and powerful emotions, can create a threatening environment for participants. It certainly reveals major differences in worldviews or perspectives. And if done poorly, it can result in misunderstandings, increased antagonism, and blockages in learning. The good news, however, is that skillfully handled, it can improve communication and learning, enhance racial harmony, increase racial literacy, and expand critical consciousness of one's own cultural racial identity, and leading us on in terms of disrupting white supremacy and achieving racial equity. One last question before we close today. If you have heard a friend or family member of your racial background make racist or racially insensitive comments or jokes, you have or have not said something to that person. Okay, that's good, Stephanie, thank you. So kudos to this group that 80% of you have said something, and the 20% who have not, please don't take this as a criticism. This is not easy, and what can facilitate the possibility for speaking up and speaking out is continued education and continued affiliating with groups who are intent on making a difference when it comes to disrupting white supremacy, to actually achieving racial equity in our society. And as you can see in this series, I'm really just, I hope, providing you some insight and information that can educate, equip, and potentially empower you. And yet there's a lot more work to be done. As I get ready to close for today, I want to recommend this one resource. I just finished listening to it, and I think it is really powerful. I like the way she provides different kinds of examples, and I think it's something that you might be able to use successfully on your own, or perhaps with a group of, well, whoever, it depends on who your friends and acquaintances are. So that's one reference that I would recommend to you. So that was today, defining racism and anti-racism, why race is a social identity category, different ways we're socialized to enact race from so many of the institutions with which we are affiliated, and there are some dynamics of interracial communication. When we come back on Friday, by the way, take some time now, I apologize, please open the chat if you haven't already, if anyone has any questions, please write them in the chat box. I almost missed out on that. Well, we still have a few more minutes. So please write any questions you have for me. I will continue to sort through them and take some time on Friday to respond to some of them. Thanks to Pamela Klecker, if you're here, for that question about the act that was anti-Chinese, who you asked, can you define or explain if it is degrading? And that prompted me to dig a little deeper and not just rely on my kind of general knowledge. Another question is whether or not you'll get the PowerPoints. Most definitely, I will provide access to all of the PowerPoints for the 3 series. There are a couple of other questions I actually want to wait to respond to. I need to think a bit more about it, except for there's one question about the breakdown of the census, the resource. That resource actually is the US Census Bureau website. And it's specifically that chart, if you remember, that traced how race as a category has been used across from 1790 until now. And what's wonderful about that is you hover over the different dates, then it provides some wonderful historical documents, including instructions to enumerators that I shared with you the other day. Well, thank you again so much, again, for all the things that you could be doing right now. I appreciate you spending time here. I invite you, if you kept track of your insights and ideas, your emotions and examples, to continue to process those. I invite you to feel heartened that the Boulder Bookstore and so many other places across the country and indeed the world are providing opportunities such as this to encourage, to enlighten us regarding exploring race matters in 2020. I close with, again, the good brother James Baldwin: not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. This has been a really great presentation once again.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and thank you all again so much for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.